Welcome to this special presentation in our series, Rebuilding the Republic, presented by the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. My name is Paul Grandal, and I'm the director of the Writers Institute. Before I introduce today's guests, Joseph Stiglitz and Nilanjan Sen, I would note that Rebuilding the Republic is a series of programs meant to address many urgent issues we face today, including the threat of political insurrection, racist violence, economic inequity, and social strife, but especially the prospect of emerging as a better nation from adversity. This and all of our programs are archived on our Writers Institute YouTube channel, so you can watch them at your convenience. I'd also encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can go to our website, nyswritersinstitute.org, for additional information. So now let me introduce our featured guest, Joseph Stiglitz. He's an American economist and a professor at Columbia University. He is co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD and chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. A recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001, Stiglitz is a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Nobel laureate Stiglitz was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2011. He is known for his pioneering work on asymmetric information and research on income distribution risk, public policy, globalization, and other areas. He's the author of many books, including People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. That book will form the basis of the conversation today, which will be led by my colleague, Albany School of Business Dean Nilanjan Sen. Dean Sen previously served as Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at Nanyang Business School in Singapore. He's been a visiting faculty member at several universities around the world. He has lectured and published widely in the areas of mergers and acquisitions and corporate finance. Well, welcome, Professor Stiglitz, and thank you for being part of Rebuilding the Public. I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Dean Sen.
Thank you, Paul. There couldn't have been a better time for this conversation with Professor Joseph Stiglitz as part of our Rebuilding the Republic series. COVID has clearly laid bare the most serious socioeconomic challenge of our time: inequality. Inequality in income, wealth, health, and opportunity. The pandemic has disproportionately affected women, people of color, and people from underrepresented minority communities. Yet, globally, we have added almost 500 new billionaires in 2020. In the same period, when we lost more than 250 million jobs. We'll be talking about key themes of Professor Stiglitz's new book, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. In this book, he discusses serious problems afflicting our country and prescribes possible economic and social regulations that needs to be implemented. Time permitting, I'll also ask him to share his thoughts regarding the evolving policies of the new Biden administration. Professor Stiglitz, it is indeed my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the New York State Writers Institute. Now, before we get to the fascinating and insightful analysis in your book, I have a related personal question. Students of economics grew up with your work in the areas of information asymmetry and market instability. However, many of them may not appreciate that the original article from your thesis, published in Econometrica, was titled Distribution of Wealth and Income Among Individuals. So, what led you to explore income and wealth distribution more than 50 years back when US was widely considered a model of economic prosperity?
Well, it was the reason I entered economics in the first place. I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which was a steel town on the southern shores of Lake Michigan. And as I was growing up, I was struck by the inequalities in our society. Seemed so inconsistent with the views of, all Americans are created equal. They weren't created equal, at least in terms of economics or economic opportunity. The notion that US was a land of opportunity, it was an opportunity for me, but I saw so many of the other young people with whom I was growing up, it was not affording them opportunities. And I saw the racial inequities in the United States. People in this rich country who had only been given a 6th grade education because they were African American. It upset me. Mm-hmm. And I had planned to be a physicist, a theoretical physicist. That was my aspiration. Maybe strange for most people, but that's what I wanted to do. But as I went through college, this memory of these inequalities that I'd seen as a young person growing up just gnawed at me. And finally, in my junior year in college, I said, that's what I want to devote my life to.
So that means the inequality obviously didn't happen overnight. It has been there. Maybe it got worse in the last few decades.
Oh, much worse. And I hadn't realized that what I was seeing was the golden age of capitalism, where equality was at the best. When it seemed to me it was so unacceptable. And then it got worse and worse and worse. So it was an issue that brought me into economics, stayed in the back of my mind constantly. I was concerned about, for instance, when we came to study the economics of information, how that provided the basis of exploitation. And so those issues of inequalities were still there. But by the time the beginning of this century, it became, and the inequalities grew and grew and grew, I began to write about them more and more.
Right. Now, I know you like to talk about in detail in your book and lots of other seminars and lectures, but briefly, how extreme is our current level of inequality? And what is its implication for the economy, the politics, and just the overall society?
Well, we can think of this in multiple ways. We can think about in comparison to other advanced countries, that we have more inequality and less equality of opportunity than almost any other advanced country. We can think about it over time, where the inequalities have risen so dramatically in the last 40 years to levels not seen since the Gilded Age and the Great Depression, the Roaring 20s. We can see it in terms of the different dimensions of inequality and the way it shows up, you might say overall, that we have the largest health disparities among any of the advanced countries and the shortest life expectancy, and a life expectancy that is going down partly because we have such inequalities. So as we look at this, there are so many ways in which we see, you might say, the outrageous nature And of course, COVID-19 brought all of that out into the open, where the lowest paid workers have been the ones who've suffered the most, both in terms of job loss and in terms of deaths. And so, it's been a double inequity that they've had to confront.
Now, in your book, you make a very strong case that the substantial inequality that we are observing in your society is due to exploitation and sort of a skewed distribution of the national pie. You pointed out to the excessive market concentration, the resulting market power, and the rent-seeking behavior, as you say it, in most of a lot of our industries. The question is, how did we get there? What are the key drivers that's kind of resulted in the current state of affairs? Is it misguided policies, wrong economic theories, market failures, misplaced political beliefs, combinations? So how did we get here?
A combination of all those. For the last 200 years, there have been two theories about inequality. One focused on those at the top exploiting the rest. The other one is sometimes called the theory of just desserts, that those at the top have contributed more, they're more productive, they bring to the table more capital, human capital, and it's just the inevitable workings out of a competitive marketplace. And the thesis of my book is very strongly that today, the theory of exploitation provides a much more persuasive explanation of what is going on. Yeah, there are elements of the other theory, and they're two mixed together, but you cannot understand what is going on in terms of a theory based on competitive market processes. You have to think about exploitation on the one hand, and the intergenerational transmission of advantage from one generation to another and disadvantage from one generation to another. Now, ideas have played a very big role in the evolution, and those ideas have affected policy. And that has been a very important component. So the idea that it was competitive processes that were determining inequality led to, you almost say, a laissez-faire, let's not do anything. This is just nature. And that exacerbated everything. And we should have known, 100 and some years ago, we passed antitrust laws against the monopolies. The wealthiest people, like Rockefeller, became wealthy as a result of market power. We should have known that. And when the inequality came down, it was because FDR passed legislation like Social Security, the Wagner Act, giving workers bargaining rights. So policy reversed that horrible inequality that we had had. But then came what I refer to as the Chicago School that put primacy on competition, denied exploitation. And what that meant is we adopted policies that allow for more and more exploitation. And compounding this has been changes in technology. So you might say nature has played a role too. So we wound up with technologies that give rise to winner take all, that make it monopoly power easier. And some of these new technologies really have enhanced the ability of, for instance, the social media to exploit people to, through targeted advertising and exploit our society through mis and disinformation. And that, of course, is a whole other set of problems that we are now facing. But and to develop ways of avoiding paying their their fair share of taxes. So these monopolists, these tech giants have gotten wealthier and wealthier and more clever in not paying their taxes, putting the burden on the rest. And then the ideology of lowering the tax rate has made things all the worse. So the share of labor has come down, the share of rents has gone up, and we have today, I would say, a dysfunctional economy.
No, I think you're right. As you're mentioning, this is not the first time. It has happened before. And therefore, the government sort of came in with the progressive legislations or, the New Deal to make necessary corrections, Take one example of this, the two situations of globalization and the advancement in the technology. Now, a lot of us will argue that both of these increases the efficiency as well as the size of the economic pie, right? Yet, both are likely to have an impact on depressing the salaries, the wages, as well as reducing the negotiating power of the workers. Now, this in turn, as you point out, reduces the aggregate demand, which sort of results in what we call the low output equilibrium, right? So what kind of labor and industrial policies you will sort of recommend to reverse this? Because others will be stuck there, right?
Yeah. So first, let me emphasize that while technical change and globalization have brought enormous benefits, policy has shaped those. Policy, the way we design globalization, the way we design, shape, respond to globalization and technical change has contributed greatly to our growing inequality. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Mm-hmm. In the area of technical change, we should have been encouraging technical change to save the planet, not to create innovations that put out of work low-skilled workers who are already facing high levels of unemployment. It was inefficient from a social point of view to create more unemployment of unskilled workers. It would have been so much better to use those scarce research resources to increase, to protect, to save the planet, to deal with the environmental issues that we face. And it was the failure of policy to do that. And that has presented us with many of these problems of technical change. Similarly, in the area of globalization, we could have responded to both globalization and technical change by helping workers move from the old sectors to the new sectors. And you use the word that I use a lot, industrial policy. We could have created new jobs in the places where the old jobs were being destroyed. And some countries like Sweden have had a much more successful industrial policy. Singapore has had a very successful industrial policy. And so, you can do these things. And not only industrial policies, what are called active labor market policies. Unfortunately, I was engaged in some of these battles, and some on the right deliberately welcomed the increase in unemployment. You might say, why would they do that? The reason is the higher the unemployment, the lower the bargaining power of workers. And so the idea that workers' wages would be driven down was welcomed by many people who capitalists, who profited from low wages. So we have to recognize that we've been engaged in what might be called a distributive battle, in which, unfortunately, those at the top have won and those at the bottom have lost, and lost a great deal. Just to highlight one number that I think most Americans find striking, that the wages adjusted for inflation at the bottom in the United States are at the same level today that they were 65 years ago. Can you imagine not getting a pay raise in 65 years in what's supposed to be the most successful market economy in the world?
No, I think it's another sector. I think part of this rent-seeking behavior, you have also often called for major reforms in our U.S. financial sector, so we can serve the society better. It looks like the legislations that came after the 2008 financial crisis didn't really go far enough, or it didn't even probably address the systemic problem in the right way. So what kind of interventions would you suggest right now, the regulatory changes and the guidelines, to make that correct,
Yeah, well, there were actually a number of problems. One of them, of course, was the problem of instability that we saw so clearly in 2008. Another one was the problem of exploitation that we've been talking about, that the banks preyed on those at the bottom, predatory lending, credit card abuses, market manipulation. And we did something about several of these things, but clearly not enough. In terms of economic growth, one of the problems was that while we were focusing so much on the abuses of the financial sector, we didn't talk enough about what they were supposed to do. And you're at a business school, you know, one of the things, small businesses especially rely on banks for a source of finance. But if you look at the lending for small businesses, it's really come down, and harder for small businesses to get money. The banks would rather engage in risky derivatives, mergers and acquisitions, credit card, where they could get 29% interest rates. There are so many other ways that are more profitable than the core business that used to be center of banking activity, which is lending to small businesses. And then the banks, for the most part, have not really been responsible citizens, you might say. The problem that we as a world face is climate change. And they continue to lend to fossil fuel industries, putting at risk our planet. And actually, since we know these assets are going to be what we call stranded assets, there's going to be a readjustment of the price of fossil fuel assets, just like there was a readjustment of the price of the subprime mortgages. We know that we're going to have some problems of putting at risk American taxpayers once again. And so, I'm putting pressure to say, you got to disclose your risk. You can't continue to lend for fossil fuels when we know about climate change. And they've been just very reluctant to face up to these realities.
The next couple of questions is again related to how do you overcome the challenges to do something? Because you rightly point out in your book that there is this vicious cycle we are in. That is, the economic inequality is likely to lead towards political inequality, and which in turn will probably preserve, if not augment, the economic inequality. So it's so-called the capture, right? So we need to intervene. At the same time, but a few days back I was looking at this, that the public trust in the US as a historical low. According to the Pew Research Center polling, only 20% of the US adult population trusts that the federal government will do something which is right. So given this capture, and given the sort of the mindset of the population not having enough trust on government doing the right thing and the right regulation, how do we turn it around? How do we sort of reverse and win back the trust and push through those legislations? Maybe it's more of a politics than economics, but I think that's a crucial, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's why I devoted a chapter of my book to the politics, because I don't think you're going to get the economic change without the political change. Although I do point out it's going to be hard to get the political change in a sustainable way without the economic change of greater equality. Because when you have this extremes of inequality of wealth in one way or another, our systems of checks and balances are going to be undermined. Those of the wealthy are going to figure out one way or another of using that power, their wealth, to get what they want. So that's where the agenda of political reform comes in. And I've been very pleased that the number one piece of legislation that's been introduced in the last several years in Congress has been political reform. And what we've seen graphically in the last couple of months has highlighted the problem of disenfranchisement, disempowerment, and using the power of the Supreme Court to put democracy in chains, to use Nancy McLean's expression. The point is, unfortunately, parts of the country realize that democracy is going to be concerned with the issues that we've been talking about, and they don't want that. And they know a majority of Americans want access to healthcare, access to education for their children, access to decent housing, secure retirement, minimum wage that's higher than the current minimum wage, some degree of security, gun control, you name it. Vast support, 60, 70, 80% of Americans want this. And the minorities who don't want this, their only recourse is to undermine our democracy. And I think, fortunately, we are still a democracy. And so that's where the issue of getting out the vote, civil society participation becomes so important. But part of that is what I try to do in the book, to remind people about this agenda of disenfranchisement and disempowerment. And, as I say, now everybody is seeing it very clearly with the attempts in Georgia and elsewhere just to make it so difficult to vote. They've given up trying to hide what they're doing. For a long time, they were hiding, and I thought my job was in part to expose it. But I got to say, now they seem unabashed by it, and I'm absolutely floored by the fact that they are so unabashed by this anti-democratic agenda.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, and as you know, I spent 15 years in Singapore, and initially when I went there from here, we used to talk about too much regulation being there. But one of the regulation there was, here we are talking about disfranchisement, and there it was a crime if you don't vote on the election day.
Yeah, Australia has a same thing. Everybody has to go and vote. That's and right. So the question to make democracy work is, you're all citizens. It's part of citizenry.
Yeah.
Now they're very strong in emphasizing you don't actually have to vote, but you have to go to the voting booth. So they're not forcing you to actually cast a vote, but you have to show up.
Yeah.
Like part of, just like doing jury duty is a part of the responsibilities of being a citizen. Going to the voting booth is part of the responsibilities of citizens.
Absolutely. Shifting gear a little bit, another challenge that all of us are talking about, you talk about in your book, every conversation and we have in social gatherings sort of veers towards that we are starting to appreciate the real technological threats to the proper functioning of the democracy in certain way, including the spread of misinformation. Now, you clearly acknowledge that, and you suggest some of the solutions for these social media companies, so to speak. Some of them are like, know your customers before you make them your customers, just like what banks sort of were doing before. Making social media outlets sort of liable or responsible for what they're publishing. And even you consider an option of making some of the companies like Facebook a public utility because because of big size and the impact they're having. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Which of these proposals would you like to prioritize, or has, given the current social and political sort of landscape, has higher chances of sort of succeeding?
Yes, I mean, let me just first back up a stage and say that part of my analysis was to try to understand what is the basis of the success of our economy and our democracies over the last 200 years, and its advances in science, advances in social science, systems of social organization, and all of these require some way of ascertaining the truth. So truth, in some sense, is core to the functioning of our society. And when we talk about truth, as scientists, we know we are always uncertain, but there are different degrees of uncertainty. So we aren't sure exactly the pace at which climate change will proceed, but we are almost certain that we will be confronting high increases in climate temperature if we don't do anything. That there's just a broad 99.99% agreement on that. That's why when you have misinformation, disinformation spread over the internet, over social media, it can be so destructive of our society. Open lies. Now, we had a president who did that all the time, normalized lying. But let me just emphasize, you cannot have a functioning society based on one lie after another. And we are become just so aware of the social harms of this information and disinformation. And as we have done that, we have to come to terms with how do we deal with them. Now, one of the underlying problems is we are very committed to what in the US we call First Amendment rights, free speech. But these are never unfettered. You can't cry fire in a crowded theater. You can't engage in childhood pornography. You can't engage in libel. So we are always in the process of balancing out those rights with the social harms that are associated with the abuse of those rights. And what we have to recognize today in the 21st century is that balance has changed because of the virality that misinformation and disinformation can have. The dangers, hate speech, incitement. We've seen how it can be so destructive in so many ways. So some of the simple solutions that I think are compelling are libel laws. The internet, the social media were exempt from the same libel laws that work perfectly well in the context of the newspapers. It was called Section 230. And so there's a broad consensus to change that exemption. That, it's still going to be the case that if you criticize a public leader, that's different from criticizing a private company. The standards will have to be different because it's the nature of the political process. When people lied about the voting machines, that was slander. That was And Fox News ought to be held accountable for that. The social media needs to be held accountable. So that's one very important action. I think in the early days, there was the hope that, quote, self-regulation would work, that Facebook would be able to regulate itself. Those days are well gone. And, that Facebook has created, quote, a Supreme Court of their own. But their economic interests are so antithetical to the well-being of our society. They make money by the incitement of what has gone on in Myanmar and Burma, of the massacres of that. More clicks, the better, without any concern about the genocides that they give rise to. So in my mind, we're going to have a mixture of regulation, intense supervision, within a strong democratic frame. We need to preserve the ability to criticize government, but that's not an excuse for the extreme social harms that the social media companies have brought about.
I completely agree with you. I mean, but are you feeling hopeful in the sense that, the Fox News now have been sued for billions of dollars simply for lying, and it's going to go through the court process and all of that. Even Zuckerberg is saying, go ahead, regulate us. I mean, because, we can't figure out everything on our own. There should be certain norms kind of imposed on us. So the mixture of this evolving regulation, it seems to me a lot of consensus out there, at least in the political process, that something needs to be addressed, right? So do you think the timing is right together, that maybe we went through this initial period where we are all trying to figure out together how these will span out? Now that we have seen it's not working its own solution, here's the time for the intervention, right?
I am optimistic. Europe took the lead. But even California had some very good discussions of what to be done. Australia, where they've seen firsthand the irresponsibility of the Murdoch empire, a lot of discussion, and they have some good legislation there. There's not going to be a single piece of legislation that's going to solve this problem. It's going to have to be lots of different things, and we're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to learn. And what we did over the last 10 years, clearly not enough. And so I think some of these things, we're going to have to take forceful action now to make sure that that our democracies don't disintegrate. It is really a threat to our society.
Now, can I ask you something a little different? As you have mentioned during other seminars and other interviews, it has been a remarkable journey for a country like China over the last 40 years. Not everything is perfect. There have been increasing inequality there too. There are other challenges, human rights and all of that. But the per capita income has gone from $150, something like that, to $7,000 right now. And more important, 700 million population have moved out of the poverty within these 40 years. Now, you're in a unique position. You have consulted with more than 50 countries, their governments, their policies. You understand their nuances. What are these countries? China, Scandinavian countries, maybe others. What are they doing right? And not everything is right, but what are they doing right that we can learn from them?
Well, this is the 40th anniversary of my first visit to China, as it emerged from the Cultural Revolution and began its amazing economic expansion. And what they did, what Scandinavia did, includes active industrial policies, policies to promote government. It's interesting today, many people on the right, like Marco Rubio, are advocating industrial policies, recognizing that, the ideology that we had was a myth. It wasn't based on economic science, and it wasn't based on economic history. The US government has always taken a role in promoting the economy. In the 19th century, it was agriculture. Agricultural extension services really transformed America in the 19th century when agriculture was the major industry. World War II, we had radar, a whole variety of research areas. Today, the internet, DNA, RNA, all the vaccines that we're benefiting from, the basic research was all financed by governments. So this myth that everything emanates from the private sector is a myth. And one of the things I try to do in my book is explain why it is that necessarily there has to be an important role for collective action for government. And so the countries that have been successful, of course, have done it, and in many cases have recognized that reality. There are other aspects, though, that I do think are really important. One of the reasons that the United States has been so successful is our democracy, our freedoms. And you're at a university, I'm at a university. I think we champion our academic freedom, our ability to think, to say, write what we want. That's really important. And I think societies that don't do that over the long term, after they go through a catch-up phase, find it difficult sustaining the kind of creativity that we have. But there are countries like those in Scandinavia who've managed both to maintain their democracies, have these industrial policies, have inclusivity to make sure that prosperity is a shared prosperity. I think you can have all of these things.
I know I don't have too much time remaining, but just to get your thoughts on the current policies or evolving policies. The Biden administration is currently, as we all know, fine-tuning the $2 trillion infrastructure bill to follow up with the COVID-related relief bill. Now, some have raised concern that all of these federal expenditures can, reignite inflation. Others are pointing out that a lot of these checks, which have been stimulus checks, which have been made, are not necessarily getting spent, but they're either savings or repaying debts. We also know the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, is talking about some minimum international corporate tax, so that will raise trillions of dollars funds to support all the infrastructure investment. So lots of initiatives coming through even in the first 100 days of the administration, consistent with the promises he made during his campaign. What is your view about these likely consequences? That is, both positive, obviously, as well as are there any sort of unintended potential negative consequences, for all the policy, and are you feeling comfortable with the direction that we are going right now?
Yeah, I am very comfortable with the direction the policy is going. I think it's combining help for those who most need the help, evidenced by the fact that the forecasts are that childhood poverty is going to be reduced by 40 or 50%, helping people poor people pay off their debts, removing some of the insecurity they face is a good thing. Overall, the bang for the buck that we've been getting has been enormous. I am not worried about inflation. We have globally enormous excess supply. We talked about earlier about being globalization. That means we can draw upon in most areas global supply. But there will be some areas where there may be shortages, and there may be some areas where prices will go up. We know that housing in certain places has gone up in price. So yes, there will be some increases in prices in some goods, decreases in some others. But again, I'm not very worried about inflation, partly because we have tools to deal with that inflation.
Currently, the interest rate is zero, right? So
exactly. And let me be very frank, I don't think a zero interest rate is a good thing for the economy for as long as we've had it, 12 years. No economist would say that the scarcity value of capital is zero. And we know that when the interest rates are very low, risk gets mispriced. There's a compression of risk premia that is very bad for judgment of the relative risk of various assets. It's one of the factors that contributed to the 2008 crisis.
Yep.
Moreover, so getting back to a more normal interest rate regime would be a good thing. Moreover, I also think we have other instruments. We have the ability to raise taxes. Mm-hmm. And that's where the initiative to stop the race to the bottom. I've been engaged in that battle for long time, for a quarter century, and I think we are about to finally get some victories in this area. The reality, America does not have a progressive tax system. Those at the top, at the very top, actually pay a lower tax rate than those down below, but overall, there's no real degree of progressivity. Everybody realizes we ought to be taxing environmental bags more, negative things that have negative externalities more, but everybody's afraid to adjust our tax system in the midst of this weak economy. So if it turns out, as I hope it will be, that we will have a tight economy, that will also provide an occasion for us to correct our misshapen tax system. And that would be good, I think, for restoring trust in our society and our government, giving us some needed revenue. We've been vastly underinvesting in the public sector, and that would be good for our long-term economic growth. And then finally, to go back to one of the questions we talked about in the beginning, inequality, the only time that we've successfully brought into the labor force marginalized groups, when we reduce disparities between wages at the top and wages at the bottom, is when the labor market has been very tight. So I'm hoping and praying that we have a very tight labor market, because I think it would be good for our economy and for our society. So I'm just very hopeful that these initiatives of Biden will actually have the intended effects.
And it also seems, consistent with your optimism, is that the private sector, the corporates, well, clearly they're not happy about the prospect of higher taxes, but at the same time, there seems to be a lot of acknowledgement on their part that something needs to be done. I mean, the CEOs of the world are under pressure to take a position about whether it's the voter disenfranchisement or whether it's, equality, inequality, and all of that. They're coming up with their positions. They like the fact that the government is proactive in terms of fixing the semiconductor shortage, bring some manufacturing here to have the balance there. So in a way, maybe they will not like 28%, maybe they will like, something less, right? So compromise is more likely than not doing anything.
But I think, they've become aware of the important role of government. A government helped get the vaccines out in a timely way. And that has enabled the restarting of our economy. If we hadn't done that, the loss would have been in the trillions of dollars. And the Biden administration's smooth rollout of the vaccine has really been a moment where we can have civic pride at what we've done.
Yeah.
And we're talking about trillions of dollars that we are saving that we would have lost had we not done these things. So, in the end, they also realized that we have the deficiencies in our education systems, in our infrastructure, in our R&D, in our care system are costing them trillions of dollars. Now, of course, we expect them to say, let somebody else pay for it. Who wouldn't say that? But in the end, they know that you're not going to ask the people at the bottom who have done so poorly for the last 40 years to pay for it. It's only the people at the top that are going to be able to pay for it, and the corporations that are going to be able to pay for it. So you have to follow the money when you ask about taxes. And when you follow the money and you look carefully about the tax structure, what you realize is the corporate income tax doesn't discourage investment, because the corporate income tax allows for the deduction of investment, of capital costs, of wage cost. It is a tax on almost pure profits. And so while it takes away some of your return, it also lowers your effective cost of capital, effective cost of machines. And so it doesn't discourage investment. And the evidence is so overwhelming. When we lowered the tax rate from 35% to 21%, there was no boon in investment. Right. And the growth got a little bit of a fillip from the increase in aggregate demand, but by late 2019, beginning of 2020, before the pandemic, that growth had waned out, and people were forecasting just a 2%, under 2% growth for 2020. So far better for sustained growth to make these investments.
I mean, going back to earlier points, they're not good. Doesn't matter how much money they're sitting on, they're not going to invest if the demand is not there.
Exactly.
Before I let you go, I want to go back to, I think you sort of mentioned about this in your earlier discussion, but you have observed that among all of these, the US universities continue to be successful institutions, not just individual, as an institution. Now we have our challenges, right? Rising tuition, enrollment pressure, the rising costs, all of that is there. It'd be great to hear that, according to you, what is it that we are continuing to do well, and where do you see the main challenge to higher education, US higher education?
Well, the main challenge to higher education is making sure that there is access to everybody who has the ability and interest to pursue this. Somewhat rhetorically, I point out that at the end of World War II, we were a much poorer country, but the GI Bill gave the right of every American who had fought in the war, which was basically every male and many women, the right to an education at the best universities that they could get into for as long as they were interested and qualified. And we should be thinking about that as a mode. Of course, we need to begin by focusing on those who've been deprived, those who don't have adequate income, those at the bottom, people of color. But we have to develop a system that makes sure that everybody in our country can live up to their opportunity. So for me, that's the first question. Now, part of the greatness of our universities in the end is that this mixture of education and research. We're about ideas. We're in the ideas business, transmitting the ideas, producing the ideas. We have to maintain academic freedom. The attack on the right against our universities has been unconscionable. It is the basis of America's prosperity.
Mhm.
And why would you attack the basis of America's prosperity? To me, it's unfathomable. So, but we have to recognize that there are those who see these institutions as elitist. They won't see it that way when we provide more opportunity for all, but they have attacked these institutions partly because these institutions have been speaking truth to power. They've been saying climate change is real. And there are some people in the fossil fuel industry that don't want to hear that story. Maintaining our freedom, our academic freedom, freedom to do our research and to disseminate ideas is absolutely essential. And that's why, in my mind, I see so clearly the link between prosperity, democracy, and human rights as at the core of our success.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz, for joining us today and sharing your insights and recommendations. There is convincing evidence that the Republic is in trouble. And rebuilding the Republic will be possible only if we acknowledge, analyze the situations and the issues, and take some radical measures. I hope our audience today, the wider audience in the country, reads this book, seriously considers the evidence, and supports necessary changes in policies. Thank you again, and I certainly hope we will have other opportunities to speak with you in not too distant future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Back to you, Paul.
Much, Professor Stiglitz and Dean Sen. Just a wonderful conversation. You're a brilliant, courageous, independent thinker, Nobel Prize winning economist from Columbia University. And I love that you never forgot your roots and where you came from, a son of Gary, Indiana. Thank you so much for this conversation.